Good morning, everyone. I'm Gus Tugendhat, the founder of Tussell, and we are a data provider on UK government contracts. I don't think I've presented here as many times as Ros has, but I've certainly kind of done it quite a few times. So if you've heard me before, then commiserations. I thought this event was a pretty big deal, but I noticed coming in this morning that there's an event on maritime procurement, which has a whole kind of 4 floors. So who knew that that was such a big deal? Today you're going to hear a lot about how new technologies are going to help us to build the smarter state, the theme of this conference. After all, public services are in desperate need of transformation. The only problem is that, as the new government has been at pains to tell us, they've inherited a terrible fiscal legacy and there isn't much spare change down the back of the proverbial sofa. So a good question to start with, in our opinion, is this. How much does the government spend on technology today and how can it get more bang for its buck? Let's start by standing back. Public procurement is what I like to call the biggest market hiding in plain sight. It accounts for 1/3 of all public spending and 10% of UK GDP. Excluding capital investment, day-to-day resource spending on procurement was over £280 billion in the last fiscal year, bigger than the whole NHS budget. And let's face it, public procurement has also had its fair share of scandals too, and is rarely out of the news. So, knowing how much is spent, by whom, and on what really matters. And that's what I'm going to whiz you through today. Fortunately, you're in good hands as we navigate this landscape. Tussell is credited with being the market's trusted source on data on government contracts. Many of the biggest buyers and suppliers in the market, many of you in this room, are already long-standing customers of ours using our data to inform their commercial decisions. And over 1,500 media citations since 2018 are proof that if you're reading about a government contract in the press, it's usually our data that journalists are using to back up the story. All the market mapping and sizing that I'm going to show you in the next 25 minutes or so is originally based on open data, open procurement data, that we've wrangled into useful data through machine learning with human oversight. You may agree or disagree with my findings, but they can all be defended down to the individual underlying contract or invoice. One year ago, I stood up at this same event and said that any suppliers of technology selling to UK government were at the right place at the right time. And I'm pleased to say that that's borne out by the evidence on this slide. The ICT sector's market share of total wider public sector procurement spend is increasing as digital transformation accelerates. And that's the kind of red line that you can see with the circle at the end of it. That's because procurement of ICT held steady while wider overall public procurement declined slightly last year. What's interesting is that purchasing of ICT jumped by over 20% during the pandemic, and since then has remained at that elevated level. In other words, COVID-19 was temporary, thank goodness, but the increase in procurement spending that it prompted has become the new normal. So think of yourselves either as buyers or suppliers as being actors in a market worth about £19 billion in the last year and over the last kind of 2 or 3 years. So you now know the kind of market size and how COVID and other things structurally expanded procurement of ICT. But what's interesting is how over the last few years, the sources of demand for that technology have evolved. This chart shows that the share of ICT procurement spend has ebbed away from local government towards the NHS, partly due to persistent austerity. So in year one, local government accounted for about 17% of total ICT procurement spend across the wider public sector, and by year 5, that had declined to 14%. And you can see the similar jump in NHS spending over that period, which leads to an interesting question for this new government. Is the path to delivering more value for money in procurement through centralisation or through more devolution to local communities? How long can local government continue delivering or being, we expect them to deliver the services that they do with as much downward pressure on their budgets as we're seeing? How are they going to meet the challenge of digitally transforming under these circumstances? Taking a slightly different approach, and this time looking at ministerial departments, ICT procurement spending varies widely by ministerial department, both in absolute terms, which is the size of the bubble that you can see, and as a proportion of their overall procurement, which drives kind of where they are on the y-axis. So let me kind of pull out a couple of examples from this. In absolute terms, the Treasury doesn't spend very much on tech procurement, but ICT does make up the vast majority of what it procures. At the other end of the spectrum, the Department for Transport is one of the biggest spenders on technology, but as a proportion of its total procurement budget, does it spend enough on tech in order to transform our railways and our roads? I'm also intrigued by the picture in justice and security. This slide bears out what Simon Bourne said in the panel discussion earlier on today, that the Home Office has become a very digital department. The live topic of border security has helped to push up tech spending in the Home Office, which is third from the right, while prisons and courts, so you can see the MOJ is a smaller circle, roughly in the middle of the line, while prisons and courts appear to get much less funding to transform. I think that is particularly interesting data on a day that 1,700 prisoners have been released early to make room in our overcrowded prisons. So this chart tells you a lot about government priorities over the last few years. I, for one, am very intrigued to see what this chart looks like in a year or 2 years from now. Shifting gears again, this slide breaks down the ICT procurement market into the top 10 tech suppliers, at the other end, SMEs, and in the middle, everybody else. And what it tells you is that those top 10 tech suppliers have roughly 1/3 share of the total ICT procurement market, which is nearly 3 times the market share of direct spending with all SMEs combined. And you can also see that procurement from SME line at the bottom is drifting up, but only very slowly, barely, really. So I think the question for me on this slide is, what impact is the Procurement Act, which explicitly tries to shift procurement towards SMEs and non-profit, so-called VCSEs, what impact can we expect the Procurement Act to have on how the public sector procures? Will the transition from MEET, most economically advantageous tender, to MAT, simply most advantageous tender, in the Procurement Act succeed in boosting purchasing directly from SMEs and non-profits? Or should the government just focus on making primes more accountable for their supply chains, their tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, as some bosses of the strategic suppliers would like? So I think quite a big question for procurers and for policymakers in government to think about really which is the best lever to pull in order to drive this important agenda. Hot topics like migration to the cloud, cybersecurity, data and AI are all trending, as you can see on this slide, which is an encouraging sign. We will be keeping a close eye on the adoption of these technologies. If you are a public body seeking to purchase any of these capabilities, then please don't reinvent the wheel. Take advantage of the experience of your peers by speaking to other buyers who have already gone to market. Let's minimize costly duplication across public bodies, or at least let's try and learn from mistakes. Frameworks accounted for 54% of all ICT procurement in the 23-24 fiscal year, with the NHS using them slightly more than the wider public sector average, and local government using them less than the average. And it's interesting that local government that uses them less is also the part of government that is most successful at purchasing directly from SMEs. So could rising adoption of frameworks over the years be one reason why procurement directly from SMEs, which struggle to get onto frameworks more than large companies do, could that be one reason why purchasing directly from SMEs is not getting kind of more traction than it has done? And this is another example of just kind of conflicting priorities. There are lots of reasons for public bodies to purchase more through frameworks, but they're not a panacea, and it may be that one of the unintended consequences of doing so makes it harder for procurers to also meet their desire to channel more of that spending to local companies, to SMEs, to VCSEs. My last slide shows that over 6 billion of live ICT contracts roll off just in 2025. You can see that in the first column. Over the whole of the next Parliament, so going to about kind of 2029, that figure rises to over £20 billion. That's the value of live contracts, committed contracts, coming up for renewal over that period, just in ICT and just services contracts. If public bodies are serious about wanting to refresh their supply chains in the future, then this chart is an example of the fact that the data is out there for them to work backwards from these upcoming renewals in an orderly manner in order to engage with the market on better value alternatives to the current incumbents. In conclusion, implementation of the Procurement Act, which Whitehall officials have not denied is likely to be postponed from the current 20th of October launch date, should in principle shake up public procurement for the better by reforming transparency and accountability. That's a good thing, so long as all the new processes and procedures don't simultaneously conflict with the overarching goal of simplification. But we think that culture trumps regulation every time. And if getting more value out of your procurement is the priority for public bodies, for policymakers and procurers among you in this room, then hopefully this presentation demonstrates that data is at hand for public bodies to start making better informed commercial decisions today. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be around all day, so feel free to grab me throughout the day if you have any questions, or please do come over to our stand downstairs where we have a live version of this presentation, a live dashboard, which you're welcome to come over, and with the help of one of our experts, you can just query the data for a specific buyer, a specific supplier or competitor, or specific technology or contract or framework, and we'll help you to follow the money. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that was useful. And I do look forward to coming back when we're next invited to see how all of these have evolved a year or two into the new government. Thank you very much.